The more that I study philosophy, the more that I realize it's all about the journey. Philosophy is more about understanding how we reach the conclusions that we reach rather than the actual conclusions themselves. So today we're going to be talking about Plato's Symposium. The reason that I love Plato's Symposium so much is because it's a very simple dialogue. The topic of conversation is the nature of love. We're asking the question, what is love?
What is love?
And the dialogue of the symposium shows how deeply one man or one group of people in general can think about a topic that we often take for granted. Love is something that's so obvious and seemingly so innate to all of us that we never really take a second glance at what exactly love is. So my goal for this video is to give the symposium a little bit of extra context and show why I think that it's one of Plato's greatest early dialogues. It really sets the stage for what he's going to do later on in his literary career, and I think that it's a perfect jumping off point for anybody who's looking to get into philosophy, especially Socratic, or you could call them Platonic dialogues. And I think it's because Plato does something in the symposium that I'm pretty sure he's attempting to do in all of his dialogues, and that is to take a simple thought about nature or reality and have many different perspectives on it from everyday people. Make stereotypes, maybe caricatures out of their perspectives, and show the benefits and the flaws in each and every one of them, and ultimately show how Socrates can pick them apart and reconstruct them in his own better way. So without further ado, let's jump into some of the context. Plato's Symposium was written in 400 BC, but it takes place around 416 BC. This was an actual symposium or dinner party that took place at Agathon's residence. And this takes place right in the middle of the Peloponnesian War. So Greece was extremely divided at the time. There was a horrible drought. There was famine through much of Greece. And it was just a bloody brother war that nobody wanted to be fighting. So what exactly is a symposium? Well, a symposium is a drinking party or dinner party that would take place in ancient Greece, typically at the residence of ultra wealthy people or just like higher class individuals. They would go all out. They would have musicians, they would have acrobats, they'd have dancers, and they would invite like the coolest, most important people that they knew along with all of their friends and family just so that they could really have a show of their wealth. It was usually to celebrate something like a victory in war or maybe a political victory, and in this case we are celebrating Agathon, who is a tragic playwright who has just been awarded a prize for one of his plays. So that's the setting of the symposium, and like I said, the topic of conversation is going to be about love, or the god of love, Eros, or just the nature of love itself. But before we get there, there is one thing that we kind of need to touch on in order for this to all make sense, and that is the ancient Greek practice of pederasty. Very plainly, pederasty was an institutionalized, organized practice of mentorship between an older man and a young teenage boy. And oftentimes, the nature of these relationships was educational. They would be trained in politics, they'd be trained in philosophy, ethics, and many other things. But also these relationships had a tendency to take on a sexual nature. Obviously, when we hear that in today's age, it sounds completely disgusting, and it is completely disgusting. And many other ancient civilizations like Germanic tribes, Thracians, and the Celts, and even the Persians looked down on this Greek practice and saw it as low and disgusting. They were warrior cultures who thought that boy love was effeminate and disgraceful. This practice pretty much only took place in ancient Greece. You could argue that it took place in ancient Rome, though it looked a little bit different. But essentially what would happen is a boy of 13 to 18 years old would be sort of given into this mentorship by his family, usually a boy of lower class given to a man of higher status, so that he could be well trained, well educated, and have some sort of social connections when he grows up in the future. Kind of like a fraternity, in a sense. Like I said, though, these relationships would often take on a sexual nature, and though it wasn't necessarily encouraged and it was for the most part frowned upon, it definitely was not forbidden or illegal in any way. In ancient Sparta, for example, after boys would go through the agoge, they would typically go into pederastic relationships for further training and further education and physical development. And while in Sparta, sexual relationships between a man and a boy were highly frowned upon and seen as disgraceful, again, they were not forbidden. They were a little bit more lax about it in places like Athens and Elis and Boeotia, as we will talk about, but it's spoken of very plainly in this dialogue, and ultimately Plato does go on to sort of denounce this practice. He makes fun of it in his later dialogues, but in this dialogue he speaks very plainly of it, and you understand that it was a social norm at the time. So now that that's out of the way, let's jump into the dialogue itself. So the dialogue begins. Plato is writing about a man named Apollodorus, who is being questioned by his friend Glaucon on what exactly took place at Agathon's symposium 16 years ago. And Apollodorus is just telling his version of the story from what he heard from Aristodemus, who was an actual attendee at the event. So Aristodemus' story goes like this. He goes up to Socrates' house one day, and he finds Socrates cleanly bathed and wearing a really nice robe and wearing nice slippers, and he's like, Socrates, this is very, very unlike you. What's the deal? And Socrates is like, well, Agathon was having a party yesterday because he just won a prize for his play. I didn't go because I thought there was going to be too many people there, but I'm going to go pay my respect to him today. And then he's like, do you want to come with me? And Aristodemus is like, well, I wasn't invited. Is that okay? And Socrates is like, I'm kind of the shit. I can bring whoever I want. So Aristodemus is like, cool, let's do it. So they're on their way to Agathon's house, and as they're pulling up, Socrates stopped by Agathon's neighbor's, front door, and he's like, go on without me, I need to think for a second. So he sits there staring at this bush, and he's just like lost in thought. Aristodemus goes up, knocks on the door. Agathon comes over, and he's like, who are you? And he's like, well, I'm with Socrates. And he's like, okay, then where is he? He's like, he's right over there in that bush, and he's been standing there for a little while. It's kind of creeping me out. And then another guy inside, Aristophanes, who we will later meet, says, oh, that's Socrates. He does that all the time. Just come on in. He'll be in a second. So Aristodemus comes in, and, people are still hungover from the night before. The dancers, the musicians are still there. It just looks like a party happened, right? So Aristodemus takes a seat next to everybody who's still there. And then Socrates finally comes in, and everybody is so excited to see Socrates. They're like, life of the party is here. What new ideas do you have for us? What are we going to talk about today? This is awesome. So they invite Socrates over to sit down. Everybody wants to sit next to him. And then a man named Eryximachus, or Eryximachus, I might say both throughout this video, he proposes that since last night everybody got really drunk, and some people are still drunk, and many people are hungover, let's take the drinking light today. One thing you need to understand about ancient Greek symposiums is that drinking was highly regulated. It's not like a normal party today where you go and you just kind of like drink as much as you want. Some people drink more than others. No, the host dictated how much everybody drank and at what pace they drank. And the way that you would normally do this is through music and dance. Maybe you're playing drinking games, something like that, just to give it structure and pace. So Eryximachus comes up with this bright idea. He's like, how about we all just drink as much as we want? And nobody has to keep pace on anything. There doesn't need to be any structure. And they're like, well, we can drink as much as we want, but we need to be doing something. This is too wild of a thought. So Eryximachus is like, I have an idea. How about we give speeches? Because that's what every fun party has, is speeches. So Eryximachus decides, I have a great idea. You know who never gets eulogized enough? The god Eros, which I think is really weird. He's the god of love. Why aren't there more poems and songs written about him? Let's eulogize him. So they decide that they're going to go around in a circle, and they're all going to give a speech eulogizing the god Eros, who is the progenitor of love, let's say. So first up, we have a man named Phaedrus. Phaedrus was an Athenian orator who hung out with Socrates and Plato. There's another dialogue named after him. But in this case, they have Phaedrus go first, and he gives his speech eulogizing love. Phaedrus begins by asserting that Eros is the oldest among gods, and therefore he is the noblest or most powerful. He claims that Eros has no origin story because he predates even the gods themselves. He says that he is the source of greatest benefit to people because he knows of no greater blessing to a young man who is beginning life then a virtuous lover. This would be the sort of pederastic thing that I was talking about earlier, right? With the older man and the younger boy. So in the sense of pederasty, the older man would be called the lover and the young boy would be called the beloved. Now, keep in mind that these titles of lover and beloved would be maintained even if the relationship did not take on a sexual nature. This is because love had many different meanings in ancient Greece. There were many different words for love. There was philia, which is a sort of like general sort of love, and then there's eros, which is like passionate love you would have for maybe somebody that you were physically engaged with, and then there's like agape, which is like heavenly love. Anyways, we'll get more into that, but just understand that he's not necessarily talking about this in a sexual nature. He's more so just saying love like maybe from one friend to another, one brother to another, but also one man to his wife or something like that, right? He says that a lover who is doing any detestable act would be more pained at being detected by his beloved than by his mother or father or anyone else. Basically saying that the opinions of the ones you love the most mean the most to you, and therefore love is this driving factor to be a great person because you don't want to dishonor your lovers. He goes on to use this argument saying that this is why having lovers in a military offer greater chances of survivability, because you're much more likely to act courageously and bravely if you are fighting alongside someone who you love to death. He says the lover would be ready to die 1,000 deaths rather than endure being seen abandoning his post or something like that. He uses the case of Achilles and Patroclus in Homer's The Iliad to paint this picture. Basically says that Achilles wanted to avenge his friend Patroclus because he loved him so much. Whether or not they were actual physical lovers or whether they were just like distant family members or if they were just best friends, he loved him so much that he needed to avenge his death, even knowing that it would bring about his own death. He concludes by saying, "These are my reasons for affirming that love is the eldest and noblest and mightiest of the gods, and the chiefest author and giver of virtue in life, and of happiness after death." So that's Phaedrus' speech. Up next, we have a man named Pausanias. Pausanias was an Athenian lawyer and practitioner of pederasty. He was also an open homosexual and sexist. He really did not like women, and it's very clear in his writing. Pausanias' speech centers around the idea that there are two kinds of love. There is heavenly love, and there is more common love. He distinguishes these two types of eros as being the lovers of Aphrodite because there are two types of Aphrodite. There is the Aphrodite who is the daughter of Uranus, and there is the Aphrodite who is the daughter of Zeus and Dione. The daughter of Zeus is the one that we call the common Aphrodite because everybody knows who that is, but the daughter of Uranus is the heavenly Aphrodite. Now, this common Aphrodite that everybody knows about, he associates with the body rather than the soul. He says that this is the type of love that is apt to be seen in women as well as youths because they're just not fully developed people yet. But he says that men, particularly grown men, and particularly towards young boys, this is the sort of heavenly love because it has nothing to do with the physical body. It has nothing to do with like sex or anything like that. It just has to do with like admiration and appreciation of the spirit or the soul, which is still kind of gay. I hope it's okay that I say that. So, similar to Phaedrus' speech, Pausanias argues that this heavenly love is better because it encourages you to seek out honor and virtue, as opposed to the more common love, which really just sees humans as an end. It sees you as like just a body to sleep with, something like that. It's more common, it's more flesh-driven, and in the end, it's just not as noble as the heavenly love. He kind of uses this to paint this picture of how societal norms shape this idea of love, because he talks about how in Sparta, this love between a man and a boy is very looked down upon, and in Athens, it's not so much so. So you can like express heavenly love better in Athens than you can in the place where the barbarians live, where it's completely forbidden for a man and a boy to love each other, or in Sparta, whereas it's really, really frowned upon. Like love, heavenly love exists better in Athens because of that. So you can kind of see where I'm going with this. In the end, we can kind of see that whether or not Pausanias actually said this, Plato is doing exactly what he does always. He's painting a perfect picture. He's creating a character and using very stereotypical things to paint the picture that a person like Pausanias, who is a homosexual, a practicer of pederasty, would say in this circumstance, right? Up next, we have the speech from Aristophanes. However, Aristophanes actually has the hiccups right now, and he needs to be cured of it. So he tells Eryximachus, the physician, to go next, and then he'll go once he's cured his hiccups. So Eryximachus goes next, and he, like I said, is a physician. So he takes on a very scientific and sort of practical view of Eros. His speech is essentially centered around this idea that love exists as a sort of harmony that brings the universe into balance. For example, in his practice of medicine, he says that there are extremes like hot and cold, moist and dry, and finding a harmony between these things is what leads to health in the body. He says similarly, you can do the same thing when you're practicing music or astronomy or any other kind of practice or art that requires discipline. Finding this universal harmony is the goal of any practice. And that's why he believes that love is the reconciliation of opposing forces, the harmony that brings order to chaos. Because of this, he argues that love is the thing that brings harmony to the universe. It's the thing that governs the alignments of the stars. It's the thing that brings about the cycles of the seasons, even the behavior of plants and animals, like Aggie right here. For Eryximachus, love is not just this human process, it's really a universal principle that brings harmony to things that would otherwise be chaotic. So, after he concludes this, Aristophanes has been cured of his hiccups and he's ready to go. Now, Aristophanes is a comedic playwright, and he actually has a play written about Socrates that I can't remember the name of right now, but he's a very well-known playwright, and he gives a very sort of poetic answer to this question of the nature of love. This, in my opinion, was the most memorable speech when I first read the Symposium a few years ago, and it's because it takes on a very, origin story sort of idea of where love comes about. Aristophanes says that the human race used to consist of three genders. There was male, female, and androgynous, and these three genders were two bodies linked together. He says, quote, "The primeval man was round, his back and sides forming a circle, and he had 4 hands and 4 feet, one head with 2 faces, looking opposite ways, set on a round neck and precisely alike." He mentions how they're these conjoined humanoid things, and he says that they were incredibly strong and incredibly smart and incredibly powerful, so much so that the god Zeus, who had created them, decided he needed to nerf them because they were too powerful and they were plotting on overtaking the gods as the supreme rulers of the universe. So Zeus decides to take a string and cut every single one of them into 2 pieces. He then says that Apollo was bidden to heal their wounds and compose their forms. So he had them turn their faces around so that they would be seeing the missing part of their body, their other half. And then he pulled the skin over so that it was tight a knot where we now have our belly buttons, and then twisted our private members around so that they now face our front side. He says that what this did was caused humans to have this sense of lack, this sense of, I'm missing something, I am not whole. And instead of trying to be strong and overtake the gods, now we spend our entire lives seeking out our other half. Aristophanes argues that love is this driving force that causes us to seek out the missing part of us, our other half that we used to at one point be conjoined with. He says, quote, "The desire and pursuit of the whole is called love." But it really makes sense if you think about it, because we spend our entire lives seeking out someone who we can spend the rest of our lives with, someone who we can share love with, someone who is always going to be there, someone who we feel ultra connected to. And if you've ever been in love before, you understand this feeling. You know that it's not just about the sex or it's about the companionship. It's about everything. It's about literally wanting to be one entity with this person. This essentially suggests that love is not just about attraction or trying to understand someone's soul better, but it's about fulfilling a missing part of yourself. I'm going to take that, Aggie. So up next, after Aristophanes concludes his speech, we have Agathon, the host of the symposium. And Agathon is a tragic playwright. So his speech is poetic in nature, like Aristophanes', but takes on a little bit of a different tone. Agathon disagrees with Phaedrus and many of the other guests, and he says that love is actually the youngest of gods. And the reason for this is because love is good and love is beautiful, and beauty and goodness are associated with youth in ancient Greece. And since Eros is good and beautiful, he must therefore be young. Similarly, unlike the other speakers who mentioned that Eros was strong and powerful and noble, Agathon actually believes that Eros in nature is very delicate and gentle because, I don't know, that's what you think of when you think of, like, Cupid, maybe? He then goes on to say that Eros is the best of all gods because he possesses all of the virtues. Eros possesses justice because all men serve him of their own free will. No one is forced into love. Love is just a natural thing that we all willingly take part in, and wherever there is voluntary action, there is justice. Eros possesses temperance because temperance is essentially being able to have precedence over your desires, and love obviously has precedence over desires, so therefore love, or Eros, possesses temperance. And finally, he proposes that he has wisdom because he is the source of all music and poetry and any form of art. Now, when we come to the end of Agathon's speech, we can see that he hasn't really concluded anything about Eros or the nature of love. All he's really said is what he thinks the god is. But he doesn't explain what love is necessarily. And this sets the stage perfectly for Socrates to come in and completely tear his shit up. So up next is Socrates' turn, and Socrates is like, before I start my speech, Agathon, I have a couple of questions I want to propose to you because you seem to have done a great job. Everybody applauded your speech at the end. And I think it's great, but it didn't really answer some questions that I have, so I want you to answer them now. And Agathon's like, yeah, go ahead, Socrates. I'll answer any question you want. So first, Socrates wants to know whether love is the love of something or of nothing, in the same way that a father is the father of something, the mother is the mother of something, and so on. Agathon says, yes, love is the love of something. Does he possess or does he not possess that which he loves and desires? And then Agathon says, well, probably not, because if you desire something, you probably don't have it, or else why would you be desiring it? And then Socrates says, would he who is great desire to be great, or he who is strong desire to be strong? Who can desire that which he has? If you have strength, you don't desire to be strong, and if you have health, you don't desire to be healthy. You already are those things. However, there is a sort of extra layer to this, because if you have something that is virtuous, like health or strength or wealth, you may not desire them, but you do desire to keep them, and you want to keep them forever. So he's like, since we have shown that this is the case, let me ask you these final questions. Is love the love of beauty and not of ugliness? Agathon says yes. So love is something which a man wants and does not have. Agathon says yes. So then love wants and does not have beauty. Agathon says yes. And would you call that beautiful which wants and does not possess beauty? No, I wouldn't. So then would you still say that love, or Eros, is beautiful? And he says, I guess not. And then Socrates says, is not the good also the beautiful? Yes. So then in wanting the beautiful, Eros also wants the good. And he says yes. So after tearing Agathon's speech to pieces, Socrates says, let me tell you where I learned all this from, because I didn't come up with it of my own accord. I learned this from a woman named Diotima of Mantinea, who is a philosopher that Socrates met back in the day. He says that one day they were talking about the nature of love and were asking very similar questions that these people were asking today. So his speech is basically a recitation of Diotima's speech that she gave to him long ago. She begins by asserting that Eros is not a god at all, and he's rather a spirit, or a daemon, as the ancient Greeks would have called it. She says that he is the intermediate between the divine and the mortal, and he is this sort of intercessor between the gods and humanity. She then begins to explain the origin of Eros by its family tree, and it's kind of long-winded, but to shorten it for you, on the birthday of Aphrodite, there was a feast, and all of the gods attended the feast. And at this feast was the god Poros, or plenty, who obviously represents bountifulness and plentifulness. When the feast was over, Pinia, or poverty, was knocking at the door as she always does, because she has nothing. Now, Plenty, who had had lots of nectar and was very drunk, went into the garden of Zeus, laid down and fell asleep. And then Poverty went over and laid next to Plenty. And then Poverty and Plenty ended up engaging in intercourse and then producing a child who is Eros. So Eros is the son of Plenty and Poverty. And because of that, Eros possesses both qualities of plenty and poverty. And unfortunately for Eros, Eros possesses all of the worst traits about plenty and all of the worst traits about poverty. She essentially says that Eros is ugly and he's very rough around the edges and he is very poor and he has nothing good. But because he's the son of plenty, he desires all of these things. He desires the good and the beautiful things that life has to offer, and therefore is always in constant search of these things. Kind of sounds like Sisyphus in a way, right? He's kind of rolling his own little boulder up this hill of constantly striving for good and beauty, but always possessing ugliness and poverty. So Eros in his nature desires good and beautiful things because he does not possess them. This is the nature of love, she says. So why does anyone desire good things? Because they want to possess good things. And why do we want to possess good things? Because they will make us happy. But we don't want to just possess good things in a sort of fleeting manner. We want to possess them forever because we want to be happy forever, right? This was a huge deal for the ancient Greeks. Eudaimonia is the word. It's like existential or eternal happiness. So she goes on to conclude that Eros is the love of the everlasting possession of the good, the attainment of eudaimonia. And she then asks Socrates, do you know what the manner of this pursuit is? Because there must be a way that we go about it. How can we achieve existential happiness? And she essentially asserts that the way that we do this is by giving birth. And you might be thinking like having a child, and she would answer, yes, this is a form of giving birth, but it's not just about giving birth, it's about giving birth in beauty. This can be done in not only the body, but also in the soul. Let me explain. She says that at some point or another in all of our lives, we will desire to give birth to something, to create something. And the reason for this is because we as humans all essentially are seeking immortality. Death is the one thing that we all can't avoid, and humans, being people who desire good things and desire happiness, know that death is a tragedy. So we want to avoid that in whatever way we possibly can. She argues that the way that we can do this physically is by coming together in beauty, which she would call the divine union between man and woman, because this is, again, it's a divine thing, it's a beautiful thing. Man and woman come together, and what happens? They give birth to a child, which is literally half of each of them, and carries on their blood and carries on their name. This way, when two people who have a child die, they exist essentially immortally through their children. By her definition, it seems that this act of procreation is the ultimate pursuit of love. But she goes on to argue that this is only bodily love. This is only how humans can essentially achieve immortality in the body. But there is a greater way to demonstrate love. There is a greater way to achieve immortality through the spirit. She points to the fact that animals in nature, they undergo similar processes that people do when they will undergo suffering and intense labor, and they will maybe face hunger and having to fend off predators just to maintain the safety of their progeny, right? Because this is how animals attain immortality. But humans possess a soul, they possess a spirit, and they can not only give birth in their bodies, but also in their souls. And this can be done through any number of things. This can be done through creating beautiful, everlasting works of art. This can be done through poetry. This can be done through acts of heroism. Again, think about Achilles, for example. Achilles was the central figure of the Bible for the ancient Greeks, Homer's The Iliad. And in the Iliad, Achilles is told he can either stay home in Greece and he can live a good life and get married and have children, but he'll eventually die and his name will be forgotten. Or he can go to Troy, he can fight, he can suffer, and he can die a certain death. But his acts of heroism and his legacy will carry on his name throughout all of eternity. We know that Plato sees the body as secondary to the spirit. We always see the spirit as something that is greater than the body in Plato's works. So this totally makes sense that this is the direction that he would take this pursuit of happiness, this eudaimonia, this act of love. So Socrates goes on to discuss a couple other things that he and Diotima talked about, like the pursuit of love through the forms and the forms of beauty, and how when you recognize beauty in one thing, you can see it in all things. When we come to the end of Socrates' speech, everybody is just like in awe. They can't believe what they've just heard. And then there's a pounding at the door. Somebody's here, and Agathon sends his servants to go see who it is, and he says, if they're a friend, bring him in. We're having a great time. The servant comes back, and Alcibiades walks in. Alcibiades was an Athenian statesman and war general who was a great friend of Socrates at the time, and apparently Agathon's as well. Alcibiades comes in, and he's like, what's up, Agathon? Good to see you again. I'm still drunk from last night. What are you guys up to? They're just kind of like, we're just chilling. We're just talking about Eros, the god of love. And we're not really drinking that much. And Alcibiades is like, that's dumb. You guys should be drinking more. Hey, bring me that pitcher of wine over here. Brings a pitcher of wine over, takes a seat next to Socrates, and he's like, how much has this guy been drinking? And they're like, oh, Socrates hasn't had anything to drink. And he's like, what? You guys got to see how much wine this guy can put away. It's unbelievable. It doesn't even faze him. So Alcibiades takes a seat, and then they cue him in on what's been going on. They said they've been giving eulogies to the god of love, Eros. And then Alcibiades is like, okay, well, I'm pretty drunk, so it's not going to be good, but I'll take a crack at it. And so because Socrates was present, Alcibiades, who was actually a student of Socrates's, gives a eulogy to his love for Socrates. Now again, remember the pederasty thing. It is likely that Socrates and Alcibiades were in a pederastic relationship, but as you will see here, it was not sexual in nature, and this is something that Plato tries to make very clear, and Socrates as well makes very clear that he did not desire a sexual relationship with Alcibiades. So, given that Socrates is older, the traditional setup would be that Socrates would be the lover and Alcibiades would be the beloved. But that's not really the case. The reverse is actually true because Alcibiades was the one who was seeking out a relationship with Socrates. He wanted to be trained by him, he wanted to be educated by him, and in realizing how incredible he is at philosophy and doing all of these other things, he started to develop like an actual passionate love for him. Socrates agreed to educate Alcibiades in philosophy, but their relationship didn't go much further beyond this. He even mentions one time where Socrates fell asleep and then Alcibiades tried to go sleep next to him and see if Socrates would do anything. And Socrates didn't, and he just got up and left. And he said that it felt like waking up next to his father or something like that. It was at this point, Alcibiades says that he realized Socrates' virtue and not wanting to pursue a sort of physical relationship, that he decided he really wanted to be great friends with him, and he started to really honor him as a person. However, shortly after this, the Peloponnesian War began, and Socrates and Alcibiades were both dispatched to Patadia. Alcibiades talks about this time that supplies were low and they didn't really have much food, and no man was capable of going without food longer than Socrates. He thought that this was incredible. The guy could go for days without food, and when food was abundant and we had plenty of wine, Socrates, who never drank any alcohol, could outdrink everybody. It was unbelievable. He then talks about how Socrates is capable of braving the cold like no one else. In Patadia, a region of Greece that gets exceptionally cold and was while they were there in the winter, Socrates would come out of his tent barefoot, wearing his regular Athenian robes, and everybody else was like swaddled in clothing and wearing multiple layers on their feet and things like that. He then tells this interesting story. He says one morning he was thinking about something which he could not resolve, and he would not give it up, but continued thinking from early dawn until noon. He says that Socrates stood there watching the sun in contemplation, and that he didn't move, and it was around midday that some of the other soldiers noticed Socrates hasn't moved all day long. He's been staring out at the sun and just lost in thought. By the time nightfall rolled around, some of the soldiers had pulled up like sleeping bags and brought their cots outside so that they could continue to see how long he would stand there for. Alcibiades says that he stood there until the following morning, and with the return of light, he offered up a prayer to the sun and went his way. He then talks about Socrates' courage. He says that Socrates was a brave and fierce warrior and even saved his life at one point. Alcibiades was wounded in battle and Socrates saved him, and Alcibiades, having been wounded in battle and surviving, was given the prize of valor, to which he offered Socrates because Socrates saved his life. He believed that he should have it, but Socrates denied it, insisted that Alcibiades keep it. At the Battle of Delium, the Athenians were fighting the Boeotians, and the Boeotians started to get a leg up on the Athenians, and they needed to make a retreat. He says that while all the Athenian troops were running for their lives, Socrates was doing something very different. He says, just as he is in the streets of Athens, stalking like a pelican, rolling his eyes, calmly contemplating enemies as well as friends, and making very intelligible to anybody, even from a distance, that whoever attacked him would be likely to be met with a stout resistance, and this way he and his companion escaped safely. This is to kind of show Socrates' intelligence and his courage. Alcibiades essentially goes on to conclude his speech by saying that there is absolutely no one like Socrates, and he loves his friend very much, and he wanted to offer up a eulogy, not to the god of love, but to his friend. And as soon as he finishes his speech, everyone just starts busting up laughing. They're laughing at him, not with him. And it's because it's very apparent that he still has feelings for Socrates and still loves him very much, at least according to the other people that are present at this event. Anyways, there's a couple other lines of argument about whether or not Alcibiades still has a crush on Socrates, but this is essentially where our dialogue ends, and then Aristodemus says that he fell asleep, and that he woke up again hours later, and some people were also sleeping, some people had left, except Socrates, Aristophanes, and Agathon, who were still awake and were discussing something else. So finally, Agathon falls asleep, and then Aristophanes falls asleep, and then Socrates, who apparently never sleeps, comes up to Aristodemus and he's like, yo, everybody's sleeping, let's bounce. So then they leave, and then Socrates goes about the rest of his day without sleeping, having been recharged on incredible conversation by his friends all night. And that is the end of Plato's Symposium. Now, what do we take away from all this? Did we really learn what the nature of love is? Did we really learn where love comes from, why we feel love? Maybe in a sense through Socrates' speech that he gives via Diotima, who taught it to him. But in the end, we're kind of left still with more questions. And that weird, eulogy towards Socrates at the end from Alcibiades, I almost feel like that was just thrown in there just to make it seem like it was a real event that took place to show, hey, in light of this being a philosophical dialogue, this was an actual thing that happened, and it ended kind of weirdly. In this short dialogue that only spans about 70 pages, we're able to get so many different points of view from Plato's and Socrates' companions that shared obviously very different ideas on love and the nature of love. And while we reach no conclusions, it's interesting to see the different ways that these people's minds work and the different ways that they sort of interpret this very broad, general idea that we constantly, like I said earlier, take for granted. And that is the reason that I love this dialogue. It's so easy for anyone who is interested in philosophy to just pick up and read. There's nothing really challenging about it, and all of the ideas are very plainly understood. And like I said earlier, they're caricatures of stereotypical people who might have similar views, at least in ancient Athens. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, please leave it a like and share it with somebody else who you think will enjoy it. And if you have not yet subscribed, please subscribe. We have many more philosophy, history, mythology, and whatever else videos on the way. I'll see you guys in the next one.